Hello everyone, my name is John Azzi. I'm a fashion designer based in Sydney, Australia. And for this video, I'll be talking through how to make a tailored blazer. This one is for a woman, but the same rules can be applied for menswear.
So this is how I've laid out my pattern pieces. This is the grain line, the selvage edge, so parallel to one another. This one is on fold, so I've just folded my fabric here and just laid out my outer collar on fold. And this pair, which is the under collar, needs to be cut on the bias. So the grain line is on the bias in parallel with the selvage edge. So what I have now is one pair mirrored of my chest pieces, the outer collar cut on the straight grain, my under collar cut on the bias, and my stand collar, which are a mirror reflection of one another, cut on the straight grain. So next pieces of interfacing are the shoulder wadding piece and the wadding chest piece for the jacket. So this needs to be cut one pair and this needs to be cut as a pair as well. So now I have my chest wadding pieces cut out as a pair and my sleeve cap wadding pieces cut as a pair as well. This is to support the shoulder and this is to support the chest. Now I'm going to talk about lining pieces. So the lining pieces that we need are the back, which has the pleat and the hollowed out section for the vent. This is the front. So the front, keep in mind, has a facing piece that we need to cut with the outer fabrics. So that will be cut later. Your side body here, which is pretty straightforward, just one panel. The sleeve patterns. So the sleeve patterns have this commercial pattern I've adapted. So we're going to have a fake vent instead of a functioning vent. So I've just squared this one off. So I'm just going to cut this one as a whole. Same with this one. So this is an undersleeve. And again, I've eliminated this section here. So it's just going to be cut straight. While I'm cutting the lining patterns, I'm just going to prepare for my lining patterns for the pockets. So I need my lining patterns for the jetted pockets. This is going to be cut 2 pairs, which will equal out to 2 reflected pieces, so 4 pieces in total of the jetted pocket. And for the upper welt pocket, this will be cut as 1 pair and you're only going to do 1 pair because there's only going to be one slanted jetted pocket, one slanted welt pocket, on the left hand side of the jacket. And for your pocket flaps, which will belong with this will also be cut 1 pair, so just 1 reflected piece. This one's cut 1 pair because we need another pair of the outer fabric, so this will be sewn inside of the flap pocket on the inside. For the pocket linings, what I've done is for the flap pocket I've cut 1 pair, for the upper welt pocket cut 1 pair pocket, and then these lower jetted pockets is cut 1 pair, one for the right hand side and left hand side. For my sleeve lining, I have my undersleeve cut as 1 pair and upper sleeve cut as 1 pair as well. Lining pieces, so as you can see going from right to left, I have my facing that's cut out of the main fabric and that is block fused. So this is the side front and this is the middle body and this is the back. As you can see, the vent portion of the back has been removed and this is still retained the same in the midsection of the body. Also, The back is sloped like this because there is a center back pleat, which we need to accommodate for when we come to sewing the lining, because it needs to be longer and bigger than the main body so it doesn't pull or pucker when we stitch it to the main body. These are my main jacket sleeves, so they'll be cut out in the wool tweed fabric. So this is the outer sleeve or the upper sleeve, and notice here how it has the mitered corner and the faux vent, and also here the faux vent, but this one is completely straight. This one I am going to cut first out of my main fabric because the sleeve is not block fused. The sleeve is piece fused, so we're going, once it's cut, we're going to fuse along the hem, and we're going to fuse the upper sections and the lower sections. This is the tweed fabric that I'm choosing to use. This is a wool and I believe cotton tweed. So what I'm going to have to do, because there is an obvious line going throughout this fabric, I'll need to match my patterns together so that it's very continuous throughout the jacket. So I'll have to lay my pattern piece out flat first, just to see where the proper grain line is. And then what I'm going to do is draw in where each of these evident lines are coming through. I'm just following these chunkier lines here because they're a bit more obvious. Now that I've transferred the check pattern on the upper sleeve, I need to align my undersleeve on the straight grain. And then what I'm going to do is marry these two on the stitching line, and then wherever these transfer points are, I am going to transfer them onto my undersleeve. So that would give me a rough approximation on where I should be cutting when it comes to matching up the pattern on each. I have just folded my fabric in half, but if you're going to do this, you have to be very careful that all of the points, when it's folding in half, is exactly matching one another. So I'm following this very strong line here, and as you can see here on the bottom layer, there's the strong line, so that's exactly aligned. So when you cut it, it will be exactly a reflected pair. Now I'm just going to lay my pattern pieces out again with my markings from before, and I'm going to do the same with my undersleeve here. Now once I'm done cutting my sleeves, as you can see, these prominent lines are matching all the way through, which is exactly what I want. So when it all gets joined together, the lines will be perfectly matching. I'm going to put these to one side, so when the time comes, I'm going to piece fuse each section. Before I start cutting out my main body pieces, I need to block fuse this fabric. So basically what block fusing is just cutting the yardage or the meterage of your fabric, and then you're going to lay a fusible interfacing on top and then fuse the whole thing so everything is just nice and stable before you start cutting. So we do that to the main body piece. Again, not with the sleeve pieces because we want a bit more flexibility with the sleeve. So what I'm doing now is the right side of the fabric is facing down and the wrong side is facing up. And with my fusible interfacing, the sticky side of the fusing needs to face down. and the smoother side is facing up. So what I'm going to do here is align the selvage edge with the selvage edge, and I'm just going to pin this nice and taut. And the key here is it must be nice and flat all the way throughout, and no rippling with the fusing as I'm going with the iron. So there is a trick to this. I have my iron here ready. So I'm going to work from left to right because I'm right-handed, but if you're left-handed, you work from right to left. So what I'm going to do is I'm not sweeping like this with the iron. So your iron needs to be on high steam. So important, don't sweep because it will create ripples in your fabric, and you really do not want that when you're doing that. So the goal here is get your iron on high steam and press down flat for 3 seconds on high steam. So 1, 2, 3, and that should be fused. And the next section, 1, 2, 3. Next section, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And so you get all the way up, so you nice infused fabric. So once fused, this is when you do a big sweep, and that formation, this is nice and stable. So you do all the way back. Done with my block fusing, so this whole fabric has been fused now. So I have my front jacket here. So I'm just going to put this here, and now what I can do is I have to imagine this sleeve hanging down by the body. So right here is the top notch, the sleeve head notch, and I'm just going to marry that to the stitch line at the front body, just so I can have a look roughly where this pattern is landing, and with that I can estimate all of these prominent lines. This is the slash line, so we need to cut all the way into the edge of the start of the dart, and this will be our drill hole here. So notches on the front piece are very, very important. The notches that you'll need are the breakpoint notch and this notch here, because this is going to be our notched collar notch, and these two notches because the back pattern piece shoulder seam is longer than the front, so it's going to have to be eased in to this shoulder seam here. Once the front piece is cut out, make sure you drill hole as marked on your pattern. So I'm just using my stiletto tool. I'm just marking that drill hole here. And also, as you can see, I have cut this little slash. This is very important when it comes to placing the welt pocket, and I also need to notch just a little bit, just here, just to mark the distance of this dart. Now that I've cut my side panel, there is a drill hole here, which I'm going to drill hole. This is to mark the positioning of the welt pocket when it comes to that stage of sewing. So I'm finished cutting the outer pieces for my jacket. So this is my back, which is cut as a pair, and it has the mitered corner down here and accommodation for the vent. This is my side body, which has the built-in vent as well. And here just one thing to point out is that there needs to be a drill hole for the dart and a drill hole positioning for the upper welt pocket, and this is only on the left hand side of the front jacket. So on the right hand side of the jacket there is no placement for the welt pocket because there's only one welt pocket on the left hand side. So I've used a vanishing pen which will get erased with heat. So I've just drawn in my dart and the placement of my welt pocket, but this is more importantly, it needs to be visible on the outside. But I've just drawn in my dart. You can go ahead and do that for the right hand side and the left hand side. So these are my pocket outer pieces and collar pieces. So this is my facing, which is cut in the main fabric, and this is going to get stitched to the lining on the inside, and this is cut as a pair. I need 4 pairs for the jetted pockets. These are the actual jets that will be sewn, and so these are going to belong together. This is the pocket flap outer piece, so these all belong together. This is my welt pocket, so this is going to be bagged out when the time comes to that. And this is my internal collar or under collar, and this one is cut on bias, and this is my outer collar. This is my outer collar here, which is cut on the straight grain, and these are my straight grain stand collars. So what I'm going to do now is actually start building out this jacket. So because this method is fusing method and not bespoke, I'll need to fuse specific sections within the jacket front. So the section I'm going to fuse is the shoulder and the armhole, and I also need to fuse the facing piece, and I'll also need to fuse according to the break point that's allocated here. So this is last to fuse. This gets fused here. This is very important because this is what will support the jacket when it gets rolled over like that. For my front pieces, I have piece fused on top of my block fusing. So again, as I discussed before, there's this strip that goes to the break point, this piece that extends down which accommodates for the facing, and armhole and shoulder piece. So this is done for the 2 fronts. For my side front panels, what I fused is I fused this section where the welt pocket is going to extend to. So I've done that on both sides. Again, I've done my vent and my hem, and I've done my underarms here. For my back pieces, what I fused is the shoulder blade and shoulder area. So this will give the back a nice reinforcement. Also, I have fused the vent and the hem section of this jacket. And this is my upper sleeve, remembering that I mentioned not to block fuse. So this is piece fuse, so one fusing here and one fusing here. This is to accommodate for the upper arm section and for the easing section. And this is to accommodate for the miter corner and the cuff of the sleeve. So the center of the sleeve is not fused at all. This is to keep mobility and movement in the fabric. And following the same process, I've fused the underarm section here and here, and I've sleeved my cuff and my faux vent section here. As well, like before, we did not block fuse the sleeve, so the center of the sleeve is left as the fabric to allow for movement. So what I'm going to start doing now is actually preparing all of my interfacing pieces. So I have my chest canvas here, and I'm going to lay my wadding. Because we've eliminated the seam allowance, I'm just going to align it right on the edge, excluding the seam allowance around the armhole and the shoulder seam, Very important because you do not want that bulk, all of this wadding and bulk to extend into the armhole. And now I'm going to stay stitch around my two pieces. Do that and come back. So I've done my stay stitches around both pieces. What I need to do now is just doing permanent stay stitches, just going vertically 3 centimeters apart. So it doesn't matter, it's not concrete how much you need. You just need to do a few rows of columns just to stabilize this onto the canvas. So this is what it will look like once it's finished. So we're going to put this to one side and move on to the collar pieces. For our collar pieces, what we're going to do now is face the right side down and the wrong side up, and then we're going to get our horsehair canvas and lay each piece on top. And now I'm going to pin everything into place and stay stitch around each and every piece. So I have all of my pieces now stay stitched with the canvas. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is join my under collar at 1.2 seam allowance, 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, or half an inch. And while I'm working with the collars, I'm going to attach the stand collars to each of the collars, but I'm not going to stitch them together because that's a step later on in the process. So now I'm working with my under collar, the one that's cut on bias. So I've stitched it right sides facing together at half an inch or 1.2 centimeter seam allowance. I pressed it open, and now what I need to do is get my stand collar, and I need to pin this together right sides facing. So I'm going to, there is a little bit of a gap here because I need to slightly ease my under collar into the stand collar. This might be easier to do because it's cut on bias, but we'll persevere. There we go. And I'm going to join this top row at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance or half an inch seam allowance. So I've stitched my under collar to my stand collar. Now what I'm going to do is press all of this seam allowance down into the stand collar, and then I'm going to go to my machine and do an understitch about 2 millimeters away from the sewn edge all the way down, so all of this seam allowance can stay securely into place right here. But first, most importantly, we have to iron all of this. So I've done my understitching here, and as you can see closely, this is where my understitching will be. Now there is a lot of bulk in here which we do not want when we're sewing because it will not sit flattering on the body, and there'll be a massive bulk of fabric appearing here and it won't sit properly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the stand a little bit and I'm going to trim or grade the seam allowance down. Be careful not to cut the undercollar or the stand in the process. So that's the graded seam allowance, and it feels and looks much more better. So now I'm going to repeat the process with my stand for the outer collar. or upper collar. So I'm going to repeat this, right sides facing one another, and I'm going to stitch this straighter edge onto the edge of my outer collar, and I'm going to repeat the process. Now I have my under collar and my upper collar prepared, and this is what they look like on the wrong side. So we're going to put this to one side and continue on with the next step. Moving on to the front pieces. So these are my fronts. What I'm going to do first as a first step is I need to stitch these two darts closed. So with a heat vanishing marker, I've just marked in where my dart is going to be. And what I'm going to do is just pin all of this into place so it's easier for me when I take it to my machine. Once you pin all of this, I will talk you through the next step. So once you're sewing, take it to your machine, make sure this fabric is out of the way, and you're going to stitch this dart all the way to here. You can leave 2 long tails and then tie a knot 3 times to secure this end in place, or you can do a back tack. Now that I have my 2 darts sewn in place, what I'm going to do is go in the middle of the dart and slice up. It will probably reach up to here, so we can press this dart open. So I'm going to take this to my iron, press this open, and press all of this dart flat. So I've pressed my darts open and flat, so it should look something like this. So what I'm going to do now is line up my 2 fabrics and start pinning. However, when it comes to this slit, I need to make sure that this slit stays perfectly closed while I'm sewing. So I have everything pinned. I'm going to go to my machine and do a straight stitch here at 1.2 centimeters or half an inch seam allowance, and make sure when you're sewing you keep this opening closed, and then I'll talk you through the next step. So I've stitched my side panel to my front panel, and as you can see the opening is still there. What I'm going to do now is I am going to press my seam allowance open, and I'm going to get a little piece of fusing and fuse this section to keep all of this closed and secure. Just one thing to keep in mind is make sure you do not overlap any of this slit. It needs to be perfectly aligned and parallel to one another. So this is what it should look like once that step is complete. So I've just fused this slit section and I've pressed this seam open, and this is what it should look like on the other side. Start with the lower welt pockets with the flap is I need to bag out these flaps with the lining, and also what I want to do is these rectangular pieces I want to fold in half perfectly, and I want to take it to my iron and press all of these flat. So there should be 4 in total. We want to do this before we start. So I've stitched my lining to my main fabric. What I want to do now is trim all of this excess fabric off, because I do not want it to be too thick when it bags out, and in addition to this, I need it to sit nice and flat. So once it's trimmed, I just flip this all inside out, and then I'm going to take this back to my machine and stitch the lining edge to the main edge. Now I'm working on the front piece with the slit, So our slit has been fused, so I can't open it completely, but I should have my drill hole marked here and my drill hole marked here. So these drill holes should exactly match the length of the flap. So what I've done now is with my heat erasable marker is what I'm going to do is I've marked half the width of my folded welt, and my folded edge needs to be facing out, and I'm going to marry positioning. And I'm going to repeat the process for the top welt. So instead of the folded edge facing down, this folded edge needs to face up. So once all of those are nicely pinned, what I'm going to do is do a row of straight stitches, straight stitching from here to here and from here to here. I've used my markings to follow the stitching lines. So what I'm going to do now is flip this over, and what I have to do is just going to draw this in. So in the middle of the last stitch, this is where I need to cut, and I also need to cut in the middle. So essentially we've created a box here. I need to cut in the middle of these and cut this little triangle. These little triangles are very important, so do not change the shape of this incision. And one thing to keep in note is when I start cutting, it's very important not to cut into the welts themselves. So I'm just going to fold my fabric, and I'm just using my sense of touch underneath. Make sure you don't cut yourself, just to get all of the welts out of the way. And I'm starting to make my incision. And I'm going to cut this triangle now. And one thing here is to cut in the middle, to the middle of the last stitch. Make sure you do not cut past that last stitch. That's for it to be clean when it opens up on the iron. And when you get to this side seam, it is completely okay to cut right through it. And again, to the middle of the last stitch. Beautiful. And now what I'm going to do is actually flip these welts inside out, or folding them in, I must say. And I'm going to take this to my iron and press all of this nice and flat. So this is what it will look like once it's nicely pressed, and this is what it should look like on the inside. Now the next step, what to do is I need to go to my sewing machine, and where my triangles are, right on the edge, I need to stitch the two welts down onto the triangle of the main body. So I do that there, and I do that here. Make sure you do not catch this while you are sewing. So I've stitched these corners down, so here and here, and the next step is getting the right flap and inserting it into this welt. So once it's been inserted, I'm going to flip it to the wrong side, and I'm going to grab this the bagged out flap, and I'm going to pin it to the upper welt pocket on the seam allowance. So once that is all pinned, what I want to do is I want to stitch the flap following the previous. So ending here at the start of the triangle and at the end of the triangle, I'm following, so essentially I'm going over this stitching and I'm only doing it to this top layer to stitch this flap down. So this is what it will look like once it's all sewn. And this is what it looks like on the opposite side. So it's just the stitching is not visible on the outside, it's only been stitched to the upper welt pocket seam allowance. So to start the pocket bag, I need to flip it to the wrong side, like this. And with the right side, so I'm going to start with this upper pocket bag, with the right side of the face of the fabric facing down. I am going to grab this upper seam allowance again and pin. So essentially I'm sewing on the inside, and where I want to be stitching, so I fold my fabric here, and again I am going to be going over the same stitch line as I did with the flap. So I'm going to end it at the start of the triangle or the start of the opening, and I've just put my pins in the wrong way. So I'll be pinning my fabric this way, and I'm going to stitch from here to here. So this is what it should look like. And if I turn it like this, it will be a clean edge, and this will be the, so it's a clean edge here, and it'll be a nice satin finish. So this pocket essentially is going to be facing down. So once I've finished with that, I flick my upper bag up, and I'm going to position my lower bag I'm going to position it the opposite way, and I'm going to grab the seam allowance of the bottom welt, and I'm just going to grab my whole jacket like this, and again repeating the process. I'm going to pin this pocket bag to the seam allowance. Now I'm going to be stitching from the opening of the welt on both ends, and I'm going to go over the previous stitching that I've done for the welt. Once that has been sewn down, what I'm going to do now is press it nice and flat, and this upper one I'm going to fold it down as well and press this section nice and flat as well. Marked everything so it's a bit more clear. So starting, you can either start here or you can start here. So starting at the top of the triangle, you're going to make your way down. Make sure you align your pocket back. You're going to make your way down and stitch all of this pocket bag closed. I've stitched my bag following the instructions that I listed previously, and now all of this is stitched closed. And what I can do is give it a final press so everything is nice and flat. And what you have now is a fully functioning welt pocket. And now I'm going to start on my upper slanted welt pocket. To start this off, I need to mark my drill holes. So as you can notice, it's on a slight angle. Once the welt is finished, it will be positioned like so. We need to prepare our welt. So what we're going to do is fold this in half, stitch this at 0.6 or 1/4 of an inch down like this on both sides, and then we're going to bag the whole thing out. Now that I've stitched these corners together, I'm going to snip the internal corners just so my bagging out can be nice and smooth. I'm going to flip this inside out and just gently, don't push too hard, just gently turn out these corners so it's a nice point. And I'm going to give this a good press, and then I'm just going to stay stitch just 2 millimeters away from the edge just to keep this nice and closed. I'm going to start the actual process of stitching my welt to my jacket. So what I need to do is position my raw edges where my drill holes are. So I'm just going to position it like this. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to mark 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch roughly. So I'm going to stitch and back tack along this welt to secure it down to the main body. Once that is sewn into place, I'm going to mark again. So I'm going to mark 1 centimeter away. So I'm going to mark 1 centimeter away from the bagged out edge of the welt, and then 0.5 again. So I'm going to stitch this time, just do a stitch to the main body from this junction to this junction. Once that step is done, I need to explain why I went in roughly 1 centimeter, because when I go to turn up my welt pocket and push the raw edge into the inside, I do not want, because this is going to extend past, if I stitch it exactly the same length, it's going to extend past, and I'm going to be able to see the opening of the pocket, and I do not want that to happen. So that's why we go in 1 centimeter on each side, just so we can prevent that from happening. So the next step now, I need to draw in my slit detail. It helps if the triangle is slightly longer this time, because it does get a little bit fiddly. So that is going to be my, also this is what the general pocket looks like. And now I'm just going to make an incision here and cut according to my marking. And again, I'm going to cut to the middle of the last stitch. And where the welt is, I do not want to cut into my welt, only cutting into the main body. Okay, so now I'm going to take this to my iron and carefully press open. So I've pressed my seam allowances open, and these little triangle bits are going to flick upwards, which is completely normal. And on the other side, I have just pushed my welt pocket inside, so it was facing like this. I've just pushed everything up and the seam allowance facing down, and I've just pressed that into place, and I've just pressed the corners to be nice and flat. We do not want any dimples happening on these ends. Now for the pocket that's going to get sewn on the upper side of the welt, I have my bearer. So what I'm just going to do with my bearer is stay stitch around here. I'm just going to take this to my iron and just press my seam allowance down, press it flat, and then I'm going to position it on the edges of my pocket, and I'm going to stay stitch around. Now what we're going to do is flip to the wrong side, and right side facing down, I am going to pin my upper welt, and I'm going to flip this down. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this to my machine, and very similarly to my lower welt pockets, I'm going to go over this stitch line up until the start of my triangles. So I'm going to stitch that down. So I've stitched this section down now, and what it will look like on the right hand side is it will be blending in because of the bearer, just like that. And this is exactly what you want. And now it's time, so you flick this one up like this, and now what you want to do is all of the raw edges of the welt, make sure you face it on the inside. And now what you want to do is get your lower pocket, position it like this, right side facing down, so all of the raw edges are going downward. So I'm just going to position it like this, and I'm going to pin it on this. Now where I want to sew is the start of the triangle again. So I'm going to start here and end here, and again following the original stitch line. So now the bottom of my lower pocket has been stitched down to the bottom seam allowance. I'm going to put everything in its correct position, and following the same steps like we did with the lower welt pocket is I'm going to carefully flip this around and I'm going to position. You have to catch this triangle down like this, and then you're going to make your way down following the 1/2 inch seam allowance or 1.2 centimeter seam allowance. Get your main body out of the way. Again, because of the slight difference in the way we've stitched it, there is going to be a slight difference in measurement with the pocket bag. That is completely normal. Just carry on. So I'm going to pin this triangle down, and I need to make sure to catch this triangle here as I'm sewing. Very important. So when you take this to your machine, first step is to catch this triangle here, make your way down, across, and then up, catching all of these triangle pieces in the process. Do that and we'll continue. This is what my little upper welt pocket looks like now. As you can see, it's slightly angled just so I can accommodate for these corner pieces to be caught down. Now what I'm going to do is, this is what it should look like on the outside, is I'm going to make sure all the pocket detailing and pocket bags are facing down, and I'm just going to give this a good press because I need to stitch these two down. So I've just pressed all of my welt pocket flat, and I've just pinned it into place just so I can get the correct placement. Now I'm just going to tie a double knot. So this is 2 strings on a needle, hand sewing needle, and I'm just going to do a double knot just so it's nice. Maybe we'll do 3, just so it's nice and secure. And now going from underneath, just catching, and then I'm going to go into the body, and I'm going to space it out roughly 5 mil or 1/4 inch apart. So I'm going in to the main body, and I'm catching one fiber or one portion of the welt pocket. So just a little bit going into the body, then going out again. And just secure the pocket foot twice, and then push my needle through to the back. And I'm just going to do a French knot. and it should look nice and clean like this. Now repeat the same process with this side and then we'll move on to the next step. Now that I'm done with my pockets, start preparing my canvas. So this is called a floating canvas because essentially it's just floating. It's not built into the jacket like a bespoke tailored jacket method. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pin along this edge, and just keep in mind here that I'm stitching this down to the seam allowance of the side body. So I'm just going to stay stitch around here and stitching this down to the side body. So now that I've stay stitched around, what I need to do now is actually hand stitch my canvas because it's still loose. I need to hand stitch my canvas to the main body, and I'm only going to do this here and leave this free floating, which will be completely okay. But the hand stitch method that we're going to use is called cross stitch. Essentially it will create crosses as you're sewing. So I'm right-handed, so I'm working from left to right, or if you're left-handed, you work from right to left with this stitch. So I'm just going to tie a quick knot. And I'm going to start by catching my canvas only. And I'm going to catch the fusing only, very important. So I'm grabbing one and then maybe a centimeter or a quarter of an inch or half an inch, sorry. I catch another and then I repeat the process. I catch my canvas and wadding, and then again fusing only. So essentially what this is creating is a cross stitch, and this stitch is very important because it still allows for movement while the fabric is still being caught. So I'm just going to do that all the way to the bottom of this canvas. Once you get to the end, just tie off your fabric with a knot. And now there's movement in your canvas, and this part is free floating so it doesn't interfere with the welt pocket. And essentially what we're going to do, the process needs to be repeated with the right hand side. So we pin all of this down and then just catch stitching or cross stitching this edge of the canvas. So I've put the front and the side pieces to one side now because the canvas has been finalized. What I need to do now is stitch the center back of the two back pieces together, and this is just one simple stitch. It's just a straight stitch and you're using 1.2 centimeter seam allowance or half an inch, and we're just going to put right sides facing one another. Stitch down and then press open in the iron. Once I have my center back seam sewn and finalized, I need to stitch my mitered corners. So with the mitered corners, I need to have the right sides facing one another. And this is a very important point, that I need to stitch at 0.5 and only to the stitch point. So these two seam allowances should not be sewn down all the way. This is very important for when I'm going to sew the lining, because I need something to sew the lining to, and this is what it's going to accommodate for the back. So again, roughly 1 centimeter down or half an inch, I'm going to not sew these two seam allowances together and stitch that down at 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Once I've stitched those, what I'm going to do is snip my corners here. And now I'm going to turn this inside out. I'm going to use my scissors to gently, emphasis on the gently, turn out these corners. Start to form the hem and the vents, which is completely normal. So I'm going to take that to my iron and press all of this flat. So your back piece should start looking something like this. The next step now is I need to join back to my side body. So these get aligned together. And again, just like we did with the miter corner, we need to leave the seam allowance unstitched like this, because this is very important when we come to stitch the lining in. So what I'm going to do now is just pin everything together. So once everything is pinned, I'm going to start here. Again, I'm emphasizing this because it's very important. This seam allowance needs to be left unstitched. Starting here, pivot on your sewing machine and then stitch all the way. Now that I have that stitched into place, I'm going to snip into this little corner. I'm going to stay around 5 mil away from the stitching line because I don't want to cut into the stitching line. I'm going to take this to my iron and press this seam open, and I'm going to press my vent towards the back. Very important. So this will be open and this will be pressed towards the back. So this is what the seam should look like once it's all pressed. So once I've done all of my panel details, what I want to do is with the front vent, I want to fold it right sides facing one another, and I'm going to stitch this at 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, excluding the seam allowance here. So again, just stitching here and leaving this. Very important because we need this seam allowance to stitch the lining to this. Once that has been stitched down, what I need to do is clip this corner, and I'm going to turn it inside out. And again, gently, if you're using scissors, just gently create that little point. And then I'm going to take this to my iron and press this flat. Once all of that has been finished, as you can see on the right side, you can see your jacket starting to take shape. And now what you want to do is you want to start joining the shoulder seams together. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, that the back shoulder seam is longer than the front. So in that case, what we're going to have to do is ease the back seam into the front. So it's roughly 1/2 inch longer than the front. So there's 1/2 inch of easing that we'll need to do. And you can do this by slightly stretching your fabric as you're sewing, or you can do a easing stitch, or you can pin it into place. I can easily pin this into place right now and stitch it. Now that I've stitched my shoulder seams together, I'm going to take this to my iron and press this seam open. So once you've completed that, it should look something like this. And what you can go ahead and do now is just flip everything to the right side. It's taking shape as a jacket. So now what we need to do next is stitch in our undercollar to this. Now I'm up to inserting my undercollar. When we're stitching these two together is when we get to this junction, the needle needs to go in. So I need to do a little snip here. So when the needle gets here, I need to pivot this whole collar and I need to stitch it, excluding the seam allowance again, here. So I'm cutting roughly 8mm into this, just so it's easier for me when it gets to pivoting. So that will allow me to open this whole section up as a straight seam. Just pin this roughly into shape, so it should look something like this. So if I'm stitching down, I'll stitch down to this point and then I'll keep my needles inside and then I'll shift my fabric to this way and then I'm going to stitch to this end, leaving this seam allowance unstitched. This is what my collar looks like now. So I've went according to what I've explained before. So I've snipped these corners as I was sewing and this is what it should look like on the outside. So you should see a very clean corner stitch. When you close it up like this, so as you can see the corner sits here, and as you fold your collar, it will sit very beautifully. Like it's meant to. So what I'm going to do to finalize this now is I'm going to take it to my iron and I'm going to press open the lapel and collar portion. I'm going to press this part open on both sides and I'm going to press this seam allowance down into the body of the jacket. So I've just pressed these open, the lapel and collar portion, and for the stand I've just pressed that down into the main body. I'm going to start with my upper sleeves, and what I need to do first thing is these corners are mitered, so what I need to do is fold that in half, and again I'm not stitching my seam allowance down. I'm going to stitch this at 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to stitch that down, do that, and we'll continue. Now that I have my miter corner sewn, I'm just going to trim the corner. I'm going to press this seam allowance open on my iron and then I'm going to bag it out. And I'm going to press this into its correct position. Now this is what my upper sleeve. So I've just pressed everything down. I've pressed my faux vent down as well. And it should create this nice mitered corner. And again, what I've said before, our seam allowance has been still left open. This is so I can stitch all of the lining details into this. So now we're going to move on to the undersleeve. For my undersleeve, what I'm going to do with this one, I'm going to fold my cuff to the correct final measurement. And this is the side with the vent. And I'm just going to pin it excluding the seam allowance again. So here, and I'm going to stitch from here to here at 0.5 centimeters or 1/4 of an inch. Once I have those sewn, again, I'm going to trim my corner and then I'm going to flip it inside out or bag it out, gently creating that point. And now I'm going to take it to my iron and press this nice and flat. Now that I have these two pieces prepared, my upper sleeve and my lower sleeve, I'm going to connect them together. Notice how the undersleeve is slightly longer than the upper sleeve. This is because I need to slightly ease in this sleeve, this portion of the sleeve into the upper sleeve. This allows for movement and extra fabric to be included in the overall sleeve. So I'm going to start with the vent. So I'm going to pin my vent. And remember how I said do not stitch the seam allowances? So these seam allowances, I need to keep them out of the way as much as I can. So I'm going to start my stitch from here and then go all the way up. And now I'm going to pin the top. And I'm going to begin to slightly ease my sleeve into one another with these the cuff seam allowances out of the way. And I'm doing a 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance around. And when I get to this portion here, I'm going to stick my needle in and pivot. So I'm going to stitch like this and then pivot and then stitch like that. This is what it's going to look like once I've sewn my underarm and upper sleeve together. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to snip into here, into this corner here, and I need to press my sleeve seam open, and this seam here, this vent, gets pressed down like this. Now that I've stitched all of my vent and pressed everything to the right side, what I need to do is actually, because this is a fake or a faux vent, what I need to do is, because this is going to be overlapping like this, I need to just put some buttons here just for decoration. So I've just marked 1.5 centimeters in and then space them out 1.5. So essentially what I'm going to do is stack these buttons onto the other. So I hand stitch those down and I'm going through all of the layers. I'm just avoiding this cuff area because I still need this cuff area to be a bit loose. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. So now that I have my buttons stitched onto my sleeve, what I'm going to go ahead and do is just stitch my other side seam of the sleeve closed. So just at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance or half an inch, I'm going to stitch this. And then I'm going to take it to my iron and press it open. And I have both my sleeves joined and prepared. What I'm going to do now is, this is very important, I need to use the longest stitch length on my machine, and I'm going to do a double row of ease stitches. Roughly the first one should be 0.3 millimeters away from the edge, and the next one should be 0.5 millimeters away from the edge. And for inches, that will be 1/8 of an inch for the first row and 1/4 of an inch for the second row. So as you can see, I've just, along the sleeve head, I've done my 2 rows of easing stitches. So basically, this is a step that's later on that we need to do. We need to ease this into this armhole of the main body. So this is a very important step. We're not going to gather the sleeve, we're going to ease the sleeve. But this is a technique later on that I'm going to show you. We pre-shrink this on the iron, which is very important. So for the time being now, let's move on to the lining of the sleeve. These are my sleeve linings. All I'm going to do is join my seams right sides facing one another 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance for both sides of the sleeve. Then I just marry this one up. So I'm going to take this to my machine, straight stitch it at half an inch seam allowance or 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, and then I'm going to press it open on my iron. So now that I have my lining pieces connected at the side seams, it's time to connect the lining to the main sleeve. So what I want to do with my main sleeve is turn it the right way out. Just be gentle not to stretch out the armhole while you're doing it. So it'll look like this. And I'm just double checking to make sure that the right lining goes into the right sleeve. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to slip this lining in, just like so. And I'm going to flip the cuff out. And I'm going to zoom in my camera for this step because it's going to get a bit tricky. So as I mentioned before, we left our seam allowances undone. So what I want to do with my seam allowances now is squish them together as much as I can and align this seam with those two openings. And then what I'm going to do is pin that into place. As you can see here, they're squished together to the maximum, and I'm going to pin this lining all around my cuff. It's okay if these roughly do not match, this seam and this seam. That is completely normal. And now what I'm going to do at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance, I'm going to stitch all the way around this cuff. So do that and we'll continue. Now that I've stitched my cuff lining to the main cuff, what I'm going to do is gently turn this to the correct positioning, and then I'm going to put all of this lining inside of the sleeve. And you should have a very nice and clean cuff that's lined with a sleeve lining. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pin inside roughly a few millimeters away from that join, because I need to go back inside and hand stitch the cuff so it doesn't come out. So I need to stitch the cuff on the inside using hand stitches or the cross stitch method that we did before with the canvas. Okay, that should be fine. And now what I'm going to do is actually pull those back to front, and this should look like this. So now I need to hand stitch this seam allowance to the fusing only, so this cuff will not come undone, so it will be nice and permanent. So I'm going to be using the cross stitch method for this as well. So I'm going through my seam allowance here, and I'm catching a little bit of the fusing, and then again I go seam allowance, lining, 1, 2, roughly 1 centimeter apart. And now what I can do is just turn everything again to its correct position, like so. And this is the sleeve ready to be inserted onto the main body. So I'll repeat this process with the other sleeve, and then we'll move on to the next step. Once I'm finished with the preparation of my sleeve, what I'm going to start to do now is I need to start easing my sleeve head. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a pin at the start of this stitching, because I'm going to start from the other side first, and I don't want, as I'm pulling, to pull out the threads. So I'm just going to grab my thread tails, and I'm just gently easing my sleeve head, and it should start to curl in on itself. Once I'm happy with this, so up until my notch, so this is my notch, once I'm happy with the amount of easing, I'm just going to put a pin like I did at the start, and I'm going to do a figure 8 with my threads. Just so my thread doesn't come undone. And I'm going to repeat the same. So I'm going to pull this pin out now, and I'm going to repeat the same thing on this side. So what I want to do after I've eased in my sleeve is I want to get my tailor's hem, and I'm going to put my sleeve head over it, just so it can take mold and take the shape of the hem, so we can accommodate for that nice roll on the shoulder seam. And I'm going to take my iron, and I'm going to smooth out all of this easing. It is a good idea to put a press cloth on top of this, because wool tends to burn and it shows your burn marks, but because my iron is set on the right setting, it's not going to mark on my fabric. So it is a good idea to get a scrap piece of calico or some organza or something just to protect your wool, and then do your pressing. So I'm just using some steam to help mold this sleeve head, and I'm just going to do that for all of the parts that I've eased in. And just after I'm just pressing down with my hand just to mold this shoulder seam. You should have now is a perfectly molded sleeve head. And this should be a lot easier to insert into your body, which we will do in the next step. So I have my main body here and my molded sleeve head. So what I'm going to do is flip this inside out, and then I'm going to position this sleeve according to the notches that are there. The most important notches are the underarm notches. There should be 2 notches here, and there should be a sleeve head notch. So these are going to be the notches that you're going to match up with the main body notches. Now that I've aligned my notches together, I'm going to start pinning everything into place. One important thing to note, that there is no easing at all for the underarm. This easing is only in the top portion or the sleeve head portion of your garment. Once I'm happy with all the pinning, I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to stitch all the way around. So take this to your machine and stitch this way and work your fabric flat as you're going. And the seam allowance for this one should be 1.2 centimeters or half an inch seam allowance. I've sewn the sleeve to my main body and it didn't cause me any problems because it was pre-eased, and it should give me a very beautifully tailored and beautiful look of the shoulder, and that's exactly what I want. So now what we're going to do is we need to grade half the seam allowance of the underarm. So I'm going to cut half of this seam allowance on the underarm portion of this sleeve and armhole junction, because overall this seam allowance is reducing the circumference or the measurement of the whole sleeve hole area, which will ride up on the wearer's underarm and it will be very uncomfortable. So that's why we need to grade it down. So it should look something like this. Now what I'm going to do is install the wadding, my sleeve cap wadding, into my armhole. Now I'm going to have to hand stitch my wadding into my sleeve head. So I'm stitching this, I'm not stitching it here, I'm stitching it on the inside portion of the sleeve. So this longer section here, the one that slopes, is going to go towards the back of the sleeve, and this shorter section goes towards the front. So what I'm going to do, there should be a notch here and a notch here, which will be your indication notches. So what I'm going to do is align my notch with the shoulder seam and start pinning all the way around. Once I have everything pinned into place, I've just threaded my needle and thread, and what I'm going to start doing is doing a series of whip stitches. So I'm only stitching to the seam allowance. Very important not to exceed the seam allowance, because you don't want your hand stitches to show on the outside of your garment. And these whip stitches are only catching the wadding to the seam allowance of the sleeve head, just to give it a really nice shape once we press everything properly. So as you can see, once I flick all the seam allowance into the sleeve head, it's going to create this really nice molded shoulder, which is exactly what we want. And now we're going to move on to the shoulder pad. Now what I'm going to do is stitch my shoulder pad to my shoulder seam. And what I have to do is, usually the shoulder pad has a longer side than the other. The longer side goes towards the back of the jacket and the shorter side goes towards the front. And this zigzag seam should align with my shoulder seam. And I'm going to position this right on the edge of my seam allowance. Just going to put a pin in there. So right on the edge of my seam allowance, and I'm going to so the reason I'm laying this upside down is when I turn the jacket right side out, it's so it can sit right on the jacket. So that's why it looks incorrect when we're doing it, but that's the proper way to do it. So once I have everything properly positioned, I'm going to get my needle and thread and I'm going to start whip stitching again. This time, I'm not going to go through all of the layers of the shoulder pad. I'm only going through the bottom 2 layers or the first layer of the shoulder pad. Remember, I just want to catch this into place so it doesn't slip out of place. It needs to be secure also. So this is the 2 layers that I'm working with. And again, I'm only stitching on the seam allowance of the armhole. And once that has been sewn down, I'm not going to pull it tight. I'm just laying it flat comfortably where it wants to sit naturally. And I'm going to catch the end of this shoulder pad onto the seam allowance of my shoulder seams. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this to the iron and press all of this into the correct shape. It should be taking its shape anyway, but I'm just going to press it so all of this is nice and smooth. I'm going to start with the back panel and I'm going to stitch my back panel at 1.5, 1.2 centimeter seam allowance or half an inch. And I'm going to go all the way up, and also keep in mind that I have my true center back notched because this slope is going to be pleated. I've stitched my back seam now. What I'm going to do is place a pin at my true center back, just here. Now, this is an important thing to note. If this is a woman's wear jacket, this pleat needs to go right over left because that's the convention for women's wear. Or if it's a men's wear jacket, the tuck needs to go left over right. So because I'm creating a women's wear jacket, I'm going to do right over left. So keep in mind, if it's menswear, left over right, women's wear, right over left. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take that to my machine and just stay stitch this portion roughly around 2 millimeters away from the edge, or 1/8 of an inch. This is what my back lining should look like once it's all pressed. And this is what it will look like on the wrong side. So the portion that I've clipped, I've pressed open, and all of this back pleat has been pressed nice and flat. I need to stitch my side front to my facing panel, and that will get joined at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance. And just one thing to keep in note with this seam is that I'm joining and leaving 10 centimeters of this unstitched. This is extremely important for when we're going to join the lining to your main body, because we need this opening so it makes things easier for us to bag out. And this is just one simple straight stitch, which will get joined at 1.2 centimeter seam allowance or half an inch seam allowance. Joined my two seams together, and I've left a 10 centimeter opening for the bottom portion of the facing, and this is what it will look like on the opposite side. What I want to go ahead and do is press this seam open on my iron and press this seam towards the main body. So this one is not open, I'm just pressing it down flat. We need to join this corner into this corner. So essentially this is going to be inserted as a corner detailing. So what I went ahead and done, I've marked in my seam allowance and I've snipped and I've left 5 millimeters away from the edge. 5 millimeters is roughly 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. So it'll be easier for me to pivot when I'm stitching this. So essentially I'm going to take this to my machine. I'm going to stitch all the way down to this point here, and then I need to pivot all of this fabric and stitch to the end of here. One important thing that I need to note is that we are also leaving around 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance unstitched on each side. Start to approach the vent portion. Just need to make sure it's all properly aligned. So I'm going to stop at this corner where I've marked this corner, and now I'm going to lift my machine foot. I'm going to pivot my fabric this way like this and shift my fabric. And I'm going to back tuck. I've pressed the main seam allowance open and I've pressed this seam allowance up like this. So it should look like this. Which is how you want it, so it can get installed properly. And this is what the final lining construction should look like. So I should have two corners for the vents, and all of this section will still be open, which is completely normal. And my tuck for the center back, and my side body, my side front body, and my facing pieces. Now what I want to do is I want to stitch my shoulder seams together on both sides at 1.2 or half an inch seam allowance. Now that I have my lining all sewn up, I just need to put a little bit of a disclaimer that going forward, please don't get confused by this panel. It should be one straight panel. The problem with my pattern is that it was too short in length, so I had to put a panel in here to widen it a little bit. I need to insert my outer collar into my lining, and the same process goes for this one. I have marked this corner section. I've marked the stitch length and I've marked where I'm going to cut. So I'm going to pre-cut this at 5 mils or 1/4 of an inch away from the stitch line edge, just so it opens up like this. I'm going to start matching up my outer collar to my lining and facing pieces. And again, I'm keeping this seam allowance of the undercollar unstitched. This is very important when it comes to stitching the lining to the outer shell of the jacket because I need it to sit nice and flat. Start from here, stitch to here, and then pivot my fabric like this, and then keep going. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Once the upper collar has been inserted into my lining and facing pieces, this is what it should look like. And on the opposite side, it will look something like this. Again, there'll be a nice corner because we've pre-clipped the fabric when we insert it. And now what we want to do is I want to clip in here where I've pre-clipped before. This little triangular piece I want to clip again. I'm going to press this portion of the upper collar down, and then this portion I'm going to press open. So these are my vent portions, and I'm going to start with the center back vent. And now I need to grab my hem and I need to start pinning my lining to my hem. And this is going to, remember leaving the vent and the hem portion unstitched. This is going to come in handy now. And I'm going to stitch to this point, leaving my seam allowance unstitched. I'm going to stitch at 1 centimeter seam allowance from this point to this point. I have my hem portion stitched. I need to start stitching my lining to the back vent. So what I'm gonna do is starting right at the top. Remember how I left the seam allowance on the lining unstitched? I'm just going to open this portion of the lining just so it's nice and flush. And I'm just going to put a pin on the side vent seam allowance just to keep it out of the way when I'm stitching. So now what I do is I have to start pinning. This junction needs to be aligned with this junction of the main sleeve. So this should be open. And now I'm going to place it like this, working my way from the top to the bottom. Very important. So I'm just pinning from the top to the bottom. When I get to the bottom here, so I'm just making my way down to the hem. I need to create a pleat. So I'm going to push all of this excess fabric down to this junction. And I'm going to place a pin like this. So this hem junction and this back vent junction is where the miter corner is, and I'm going to pin this up, the excess. I just want all of the excess to be in line with where I've placed the miter corner. And then I'm going to push all of this excess up. And very important to start your stitch where your hem stitching has ended. I'm going to start right here and I'm going to go up, stitch up all the way to meet this stitching up here. Again, keeping in mind we do not catch any of the seam allowance of the outer seam allowance of the vent. Back vent stitched now to the lining, and what I'm going to go ahead and do is remove this pin, which I've pinned the side seam allowance vent to, and now I'm just going to turn this out just so you guys can have a look at what it's looking like. Something like this, which is exactly what you want. And now I'm going to take this to the iron and just give it a good press just so everything is nice and flat. Now that I've stitched my back vent, now it's time to start the process with my side vent. And now what I want to do is, again, stitch the bottom so this is the hem of my side body and my front. And again, we have left the seam allowance unstitched at the bottom. Now what I want to do is just extending the seam allowance out slightly. I just want to match up my side body to the front seam allowance here. And I'm only going to be stitching to this point because I don't want to interfere with all of this section yet. So now what I'm going to do is just position this lining allowance. I'm just going to stitch from the end of my seam allowance here of the main body to my seam allowance here at 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I've stitched the bottom lining to my top lining, which is exactly what I want to do. And now what I need to do is, starting from the top to the bottom, again, this seam allowance is open. I'm just going to marry those 2 points together like so. And I'm going to start pinning. And it's easier to unbag or turn it wrong side out for this part of the hem. And I'm just going to pin. Very important to start from top to bottom because you need to create that pleat at the bottom. Again, there's going to be excess fabric, which is exactly what you want because you need the lining to be bigger than the main fabric. So I'm just going to push everything down to the sewn point of the side panel, and I'm going to pin. So that's where my stitching is. That's exactly where I've pinned, and all of this excess gets pushed up like this, folded up, I must say. And I pin that into place like this. Now when I go to my machine, I'm going to stitch from this last stitch point all the way to this stitch point. Now that I've stitched the side portion of my side vent, I'm just going to turn everything inside out to what the vent should start looking like. Now I'm going to go to my iron and give this a good press and repeat this process on the other side. The side vents and the back vents together, and I've just given it a good press, and it should look something like this. If there is some puckering happening in this corner, then you might need to go in and snip the corner that's not snipped, and just to flatten all of this portion out. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to place a couple of pins, and then I'm just going to turn this inside out, and I'm just going to catch the seam allowance to the fusing. And I'm just going to do that using our cross stitch hand sewing method, like so. Once I'm done with that, I can just take my pins out here, and my lining should be secured. My hem should be secured into place because I've done all of those hand stitching from the inside. Now, I don't want to do this yet to this section because I'm actually going to start bagging everything out, which will be the next step. This step, I need to start bagging everything out. So I'm going to turn everything to the right sides facing one another. And I'm just making sure everything inside. So just everything right sides. So the facing section, the thing with the facing, the very important note to keep in mind is that I need to stitch to this point basically. So just the stitch length here, I'm just going to match that. As you can imagine, there's seam allowance here and there's seam allowance here. I'm only stitching to this point. So I need to marry those 2 points up here, like so. So this is my starting point. I need this seam allowance so I can stitch these two together and be able to stitch the hem to the lining. But first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin all the way around and show everyone the bagging out step. So where the facing connects to the collar, I want to keep my seam allowances open on both sides, and I want to match them up as much as I can with one another. And I'm just going to put a pin just to secure those two into place. And when I'm stitching, I want to stitch roughly 3 mils past the stitching, and then I'm going to continue my stitching around here. Stitch, pivot, and then stitch around. So I have everything pinned in place now. So I'm going to start from this facing here, and I'm going to work my way around, and as we spoke about before, paying attention to this notch area here and going around. Again, same process when it comes to this. Same process when it comes to this junction, and then we work our way around again to here, and then we're going to stop on the other side of the facing, leaving the end of the facing unstitched. I've stitched everything together. I have left the facing seam allowance unstitched, and I've just stitched all the way around, and now it's time to start clipping. So I need to reduce the bulk as much as I can, so I'm just going to trim as much as I can off of this section. And I'm going to snip. So I've just graded my seam allowance here and just trimmed my corners just so they can bag out properly at this section, just so the curve is nice and smooth. Millimeters. Forgive me, 0.3 millimeters here. I've only stitched to this section. Now what I want to do is just snip this area, and I'm going to leave it roughly 0.3 millimeters away from the edge. So I'm just going to snip that. And this is going to be loose here. Now what I want to do is fold this seam allowance down, and I'm going to position the lining down here, and I'm going to stitch the lining at 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'll stitch this and then I'll talk through the next step. So I've stitched this bottom section here, and now paying attention, my lining is going all the way to the bottom, then I'm going to fold it in like so. So because I have this cut here, it's going to make things easier for me when I'm sewing. And now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to stitch this down, joining all of this section together. So it should look something like this once you're finished. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm just going to trim all of this excess fabric here, making sure I don't snip too much, just so it can bag out nicely. Stitch my lining and my outer shell together. What I want to do now is actually turn everything inside out to the right side. So I'm going to use the armhole, one of the armholes, and I'm gently going to turn everything inside out. Please be very gentle because we don't want to stretch the armhole too much. So just slowly turn this out. And create this pleat at the bottom of the jacket. Now I want to take this to the iron and just give it a good press. And I'm just going to make sure that the underside is slightly, roughly 1 millimeter going in, because I don't want the underside to peek out of the main jacket. Now, a little trick that I want to point out when it comes to ironing is this part at my collar and lapel junction. It is slightly puckering. What I want to do is I want to take this to my ironing board and I'm going to pin the edge of my lapel and then pin the point of my collar, and I'm going to slightly stretch this out just so it eliminates all of this puckering. And I'm just going to give this a pin here so it stays in place. And then I'm going to go to my iron. Do not iron over your pins, just iron this section of the lapel and collar junction. Iron it with high steam and press it into shape. As you can see, the jacket is starting to take shape. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do all of my catch stitches and finishing details. So we still have our armholes open, which is exactly what we want, so we can access the jacket from the inside. I need to pin my hem on the front. We've already done this step for the back, so I'm just going to repeat the process for the front, and I'm just going to access the jacket from the inside. And I'm going to stitch the seam allowance to my main body using the seam allowance and the fusing of the body. As you can see, it's all been caught, and now that I'm finished with the hem part, I need to catch the seam allowance of the top vent to the seam allowance of the outer jacket. So here, so this is the seam allowance that I want to catch, so it's not moving around. So whip stitches are basically it's more so the motion of the stitch. It's just going back in and this should be secured now. So if I pull it up, it should pull up the whole jacket, which is exactly what I want. It will look like this. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other side here. And now that I'm finished with my vents, what I need to do now is actually, I need to catch the bottom of my undercollar with the top of the undercollar. So I need to go inside of my jacket and just grabbing the seam allowances, following the shape of the collars, just going to pin that into place. Now with this step, you can actually go by the machine and stitch it into place, or if you're more comfortable hand sewing it, you can do hand sewing method as well. Both are absolutely fine. I'm going to do this by machine because I feel like machine stitching it is slightly more stronger. So I'm just following the shape. So I'm holding these two seam allowances in and I'm just pinning that into place like this. Now I'm going to go to my machine and I'm just going to stitch. I'm not stitching on the stitch line, I'm just stitching roughly 3 mils away from the stitch line. I'm just going to do a straight stitch just so I can catch all of that down. So now my two collars have been stabilized. As you can see, I can't pull them apart from the neckline. So this is exactly what I want. I want it to be nice and stable. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the shoulder section inside out slightly. And I'm going to start positioning the lining armhole. Now what I'm going to do is do a basting stitch where I just basically tack the lining around to the seam allowance. So at this point I have everything stitched around my armhole with the lining. Now what I want to do, this step is very important. Put your hand through here because this section of the lining, the sleeve lining, has a tendency to twist, and then when you stitch it and it's twisted, the arm doesn't actually go through. So we need to make it a nice tube so it can go through. Nice cylindrical. I'm going to start with the underarm section. I'm going to fold my seam allowance in roughly 1.2 and I'm going to pin everything into place. What I'm going to do is hide the actual basting stitches when you go around. So you want to see that on the outside. As you can see, there is a bit of a difference, which is completely normal because there is easing built into the pattern. Now I'm just going to fold the seam allowance as best as I can, and I'm just going to pin that at the sleeve head point. And I'm going to angle that towards the back. Now I've just created that pleat, which is completely fine. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a slip stitch. For the slip stitch, I'm just discreetly going to put a knot underneath the fabric. And I'm going to grab one section of the fabric and then I'm going to go under. Now the distance between each stitch is roughly 0.5 or half a centimeter between each stitch. So I've gone underneath the body fabric and I'm going to catch another portion and I'm going to slip out again, catch a little bit, go under, so essentially it's creating a very discreet stitch that's not very visible. So I want to do that all the way around. But when it comes to this pleat, I'll talk you guys through what you can do. When it gets to this pleat, it's very important that all the layers get caught when you're stitching this. So I'm going to go through the bottom layer, middle layer, and then the top layer. And then I'm going to repeat my slip stitch and I'm going to go through the layers again because I want to really secure that pleat into place and I don't want it to slip. Start pressing my lapel. So first thing what I need to do is I need to measure down exactly where my breakpoint is, and mine's at the 35 centimeter mark, which is roughly 14 inches. So what I want to do to start off with is make sure that my facing is slightly peeking through, because when I go to do my permanent press for my lapel, I want all of this fabric to sit behind. So my main fabric is getting pressed in slightly at roughly 0.3 mil. And then when I press it permanently, it won't peek through the main fabric, if that makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now what I can do, I've just positioned my jacket. The sleeve part is on the edge of my ironing board, and my break point I'm just going to pin to the ironing board. And now I'm just going to fold my lapel to the position that it wants to be. And I'm just going to give this a very good press so it permanently stays in place. Now that my lapel is pressed into place, I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. Now I'm going to do a thread marking. So I've done my covered button And my covered button is roughly 3 centimeters in width, and I'm going to make my buttonhole 3.5, just so the button is able to go through the actual opening. Now, the thread marking for the buttonhole is only just a temporary stitch to actually position the button. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through this junction 3 times. So basically I'm just looping the thread around on itself, and I'm making sure to go through all the layers just so I can keep everything in place. 2 and 3, and then I go in the middle, and then I'm just going to do a basting stitch. And then I'm going to repeat the process and loop my thread around 3 times. So that's my thread marking, so I can take that to my buttonhole machine or my domestic machine and create this buttonhole. Because my jacket is a female jacket, this is going to be right over left, but if you're making a menswear jacket, it's left over right, so the buttonhole would be on the other side.